Come on. Yeah? All right. So, we're closing in. We're almost to the books of Kings now. But one more little piece of, I hope you like going out to the cutting edge a little bit and understanding what kind of archaeologists argue about. But now we're going to kind of tuck that in our back pocket, and we're going to start talking about the text. Okay? And in order to do that, I want to first look at the big picture. One of the things that you've been trained to do very well is to pay attention to literary genre and to ask questions, basic information questions about what kind of text it is and when was it written and in what context and by whom, if you can figure it out, and that kind of stuff. I want to take the question of literary genre, what kind of text is it, to a bit of a different level at this point to help you get a little more nuance in your understanding. So first of all, what we're going to do is talk about a very common theory that is held by biblical scholars, that the books of Kings are part of a larger text, a larger set of texts that all go together, that are called together the Deuteronomistic History. Isn't that a hard one to say? Deuteronomistic History. But we'll just say DH for fun, okay? DH, Deuteronomistic History. So we will talk about the theory, and then we will talk about the evidence for the theory, and then we'll do some evaluation. By the way, I'm going to need many readers. So we have a microphone for the readers, and I'm going to need many people to read text for me. So when I ask you to read text, let's get volunteers real quickly so we can get reading and get through that, okay? So that's the evidence that you want to be able to see. Okay, first of all, the theory. The theory is that a whole series of texts in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament are, in fact, one compilation of texts, and it's all rooted in Deuteronomy. So there are specific things in Deuteronomy, and these texts are really interested in how those standards or ideas from Deuteronomy play themselves out in historical narrative. Okay? And the theory is basically this, that the DH consists of the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That in some sense they are all one. That is, they are all compiled by the same editor, or redactor is the common word, and that person lived sometime during the Babylonian exile. And of course, but that person used a whole bunch of earlier sources, right? So all these books were put together, and they're all shaped around Deuteronomy. Okay, that's the theory. Now we're going to see, and so you have an exilic redactor, an editor who lives during the exile, who has a whole bunch of sources, and he sort of stitches these things together and shapes the whole thing based upon the standards of Deuteronomy. Now you probably have noticed already, having read especially Judges, Samuel, and Kings, that they are very similar to one another. The style is very similar vocabulary, very similar perspective on the world, very similar issues, and Joshua to some extent too. So that's the theory. Now, how well does the theory hold up to the evidence? Well, in order to understand that, we need to first of all look at Deuteronomy, and then we'll look at these other texts to see, do they fit? So first of all, Deuteronomy. So I need 3 readers. One to do the section here from Deuteronomy 12. Who will do that? I need somebody, okay, right here. Who's going to do Deuteronomy 30? Okay, Deuteronomy 30, and who's going to do Deuteronomy 17? Okay, those are my 3 readers. So let's get our first reader going, Deuteronomy chapter 12. Three big issues here. The ideal of worship, behavioral standards, and the ideal king. Go ahead.
These are the decrees and regulations you must be careful to obey when you live in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must obey them as long as you live. When you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree. Break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars. burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the names of their gods. Do not worship the Lord your God in the way these pagan peoples worship their gods. Rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship he himself will choose from among all the tribes, the place where his name will be honored. There you will bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your sacred offerings, your offerings to fulfill a vow, your voluntary offerings, and your offerings of the firstborn animals of your herds and flocks. There you and your families will feast in the presence of the Lord your God, and you will rejoice in all you have accomplished because the Lord your God has blessed you.
Okay, so in short, the big standards here, keep this in mind, get rid of those gods, stop worshiping at the high places where they are typically worshiped, and do positively worship in the place, right? The one place your God will choose. And of course, with the building of the temple, that place will be what? Jerusalem. Okay, so bear that in mind. Now, Deuteronomy 30. Who will do that? We have? Okay.
Now listen, today I'm giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God and to keep his commands, decrees, and regulations by walking in his ways. If you do this, you will live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are about to enter and occupy. But if your heart turns away and you refuse to listen, and if you are drawn away to serve and worship other gods, then I warn you now that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live a long, good life in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. Today I have given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your descendants might live. You can make this choice by loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and committing yourself firmly to him. This is the key to your life, and if you love and obey the Lord, you will live long in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay, so what are you supposed to do? Love and obey the Lord, and if you do what? You will live long in the land. And presumably if you don't, you won't. Okay? Deuteronomy 17. We need the mic over here.
All right, KJV. When thou art come unto the land which thy Lord thy God giveth thee. I'm just kidding, I'll switch it, sorry. You are about to enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think, we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select as a king the man the Lord your God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. For the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instructions on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep a copy with him and repeat it daily as long as he lives. That way he will learn to fear the Lord his God by obeying all the terms of these instructions and decrees. This regular reading will prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he is above his fellow citizens. It will also prevent him from turning away from these commands in the smallest way, and it will ensure that he and his descendants will reign for many generations in Israel.
Okay, so quick summary then. The king is not supposed to do certain things, and he's supposed to do certain things. So what's he not supposed to do?
Horses.
Not lots of horses, chariots, wives, money. Okay? And which, by the way, are kind of all the standards of wealth and status in the ancient world. And then what is he supposed to do? Make a copy of the Torah, right? And read it, consult it regularly, and do what it says. Okay? So these are when we refer to the DH, we're referring to the working out of these standards. The standards of worship, the standards of behavior, and the standards of what the good king, how the good king should behave. Okay? So now, let's look at the individual texts to see how well they hold up. So I'll just recap Joshua. Let's get somebody to do Judges. Who will do Judges? Somebody? Okay, Judges right here. We got, and then 1 Samuel. All right, 1 Samuel here. Okay. So recap, you remember this, the very end of the book of Joshua, that when Joshua says, choose this day whom you will serve, right? If it's the Lord, serve him with all your heart. If it's not, go your own way. If you follow the Lord, you'll have blessings. If you don't, you'll have cursings. And then that classic line that he concludes with, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Okay, so that's about the best I can do in Joshua. Let's go to Judges.
The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot about the Lord their God, and they served the images of Baal and Asherah poles. Then the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he turned them over to King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim. And the Israelites served Cush Rishathaim for 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a rescuer to save them. His name was Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother Kenaz. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he became Israel's judge. He went to war against King Cushan Rishathaim of Aram, and the Lord gave Othniel victory over him. So there was peace in the land for 40 years. Then Othniel, son of Kenaz, died.
Okay, so here we have one of the judges, Othniel. And what you see is this construction, which I hope you saw when you studied the book of Judges. You have this circular construction of the text. And you can express it in numerous ways. I used ours just for fun. All right, you have rebellion, the people of Israel rebel. Then in response to rebellion, repression, in this case, Cushan Rishathaim. And then repentance, right? And then when in response to repentance, God raises up a judge, and you have restoration. And then you start the whole process over again. So here's a nice little snapshot in 4 verses of that cycle that you see over and over again. Note it starts with the Hebrews turning away from the standards of Deuteronomy. They're following the Asherahs and worshiping at the poles, etc., and that starts the thing going. Okay? So there you see that Deuteronomistic standards being applied in each case of this cycle in the book of Judges. Who's got 1 Samuel? Okay.
Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop, listen to what the Lord told me last night." "What did he tell you?" Saul asked. And Samuel told him, "Although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribe of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they are all dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul insisted. "I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and plunder to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and its submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness is as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Saul admitted to Samuel, "Yes, I have sinned. I have disobeyed your instructions and the Lord's commands. For I was afraid of the people and did what they demanded. But now please forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel replied, "I will not go back with you. Since you have rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king of Israel."
Okay, so here we have a king not fulfilling the standards of the ideal king, right? He's keeping all the good stuff for himself after the battle. He's not obeying the word of the prophet when he goes into the situation. He's not destroying the other gods and whatever. So there's a violation of that particular standard of Deuteronomy. Now let's go to Kings and see a little bit of evidence from the books of Kings. So I need somebody to do 1 Kings 16. Who will do that? All right, here we go. 2 Kings 22 and 23. You do it? Are you holding up your hand? Sure, do it again. All right. I need somebody else here. 24. 2 Kings 24. Here we go. And 2 Kings 25. Back there. Okay. So let's get 1 Kings 16. Who's got that? Yeah.
But Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. He followed the example of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, in all the sins he had committed and led Israel to commit. The people provoked the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, with their worthless idols. The rest of the events in Omri's reign, the extent of his power, and everything he did are recorded in the book of the history of the king of Israel. When Omri died, he was buried in Samaria. Then his son Ahab became the next king.
Okay, so here's your classic so-and-so did evil formula that you see over and over again in the text of the Kings. And for our purposes, this is just one example of a king who did not uphold the Deuteronomistic standards. He, rather than getting rid of the other gods, he embraced the other gods, and so he receives this negative judgment formula. Notice also the reference to the use of sources, right? The author is saying all these other things you want to read about them, read the annals of the kings of Israel, right? He's got a copy, he's working from that. He's taking part of it, he's selecting out part of it that he wants to write about, but he's saying, you know, you want to read the rest, read the rest. You can go see it. So this is that idea of the exilic redactor having earlier sources that he's utilizing to make this overall narrative, but he's utilizing the part that has to do with the standards of Deuteronomy. Who's got chapter 22?
Right here.
Okay.
Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. His mother was Jedidah, the daughter of Adiah from Bozkath. He did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight and followed the example of his ancestor David. He did not turn away from doing what was right. And
Okay,
then,
so there's your positive king formula, much less common formula. And then we have a summary statement about him in chapter 23.
Then Josiah demolished all the buildings of the pagan shrines in the towns of Samaria, just as he had done at Bethel. They had been built by the various kings of Israel and had made the Lord very angry. He executed the priests of the pagan shrines on their own altars, and he burned human bones on the altars to desecrate them. Finally, he returned to Jerusalem. King Josiah then issued this order to all the people: you must celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God as required in this book of the covenant. There had not been a Passover celebration like that since the time when the judges ruled in Israel, nor throughout all the years of the kings of Israel and Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah's reign, this Passover was celebrated to the Lord in Jerusalem. Josiah also got rid of the mediums and psychics, the household gods, the idols, and every other kind of detestable practice, both in Jerusalem and throughout the land of Judah. He did this in obedience to the laws written in the scroll that Hilkiah the priest found in the Lord's temple. Never before had there been a king like Josiah, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and soul and strength, obeying all the laws of Moses. And there has never been a king like him since.
Okay, so Josiah is the positive example of the king who did abide by the Deuteronomistic standards. And what did he do? He read the law. He applied it, right? The people doing the Passover celebration. And he also got rid of the other gods. Okay? So 24.
Can you help with the name?
What?
Jehoiakim. During Jehoiakim's reign over Nebuchadnezzar,
Jehoiakim, yeah, okay.
Jehoiakim of Babylon invaded the land of Judah. Jehoiakim surrendered and paid him tribute for 3 years, but then rebelled. Then the Lord sent bands of Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite raiders against Judah to destroy it, just as the Lord had promised through his prophets. These disasters happened to Judah because of the Lord's command. He had decided to banish Judah from his presence because of the many sins of Manasseh, who had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. The Lord would not forgive this.
Okay, so this is very important in these books, that the destruction of the temple and the deportation of the people in Jerusalem, the destruction of the kingdom of Judah, that God did that, right? God was using that to chasten his people because they did not follow the standards of Deuteronomy, especially in the person of Manasseh. And chapter 25.
And it came to pass in the 7th and 13th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, that evil Mordek, king of Babylon, in that year he began to reign, did lift up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, out of prison. And he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of kings that were with him in Babylon. And he changed his prison garments, and he did eat bread continual before him in all the days of his life. And his allowance was a continual allowance given him of the king, a daily rate for every day and all the days of his life.
Okay, so so these are the last words of the Second Kings. So according to this theory, these are the last words of the Deuteronomistic history. And it's interesting because the whole thing ends with this question mark. Jehoiakim, descendant from David, in exile, in Babylon, is freed from prison. He's eating at the king's table, and the whole book ends with this big question mark. Will he get it? Will he restore the monarchy to Israel? Will he uphold the promise? Will he abide by the standards of Deuteronomy? Will the kingdom of descendants of David be restored? There's this grand question mark that ends the book, which gives you a sense of when it was written. That is, Jehoiakim's still alive, and the question mark still remains a question mark. Now we know from later, in fact, the answer is no. In fact, Jehoiakim will not be restored. In fact, he will die in exile. In fact, he will not uphold the standards of Deuteronomy, et cetera, et cetera. But that question mark gives us a good glimpse, I think, of the perspective of the exilic redactor. So when you put all these pieces together, there is something to be said for the idea of the Deuteronomistic history. And so now let's turn our attention to evaluation. And this is something that you probably haven't paid attention to yet. And so I'm going to speak to you now as a professor and as a practitioner of history, as an academic discipline. When you ask the question of any text, what genre is it, and why did this particular author choose this particular genre? One of the answers to that question is historical narrative. And of course, you paid attention to that, and you've run into lots of historical narratives. What I want to do now is take you a bit deeper. What kind of historical narrative? There's actually a bunch of different kinds of historical narratives, and they're not all the same. So let's not make the assumption they are all the same. Every historian, everybody who writes a historical narrative is writing from a particular perspective and concerned about particular issues and makes choices based upon sources. What do I include and what do I not? We saw that in Kings, right? That there's all these references. If you want to read more, go to the Annals of the Kings of Israel. I'm choosing not to include that stuff. For the most part, the story of the kings, they don't include battles, they don't include economic reforms, they don't include fortifications, they don't include all kinds of things that kings do. The author chooses particular aspects of those kings' lives, the particular aspect about worship and high places and whether they obeyed the covenant and that sort of stuff, because that's what the editor is really interested in. So every historian makes choices, and every historian shapes those choices into a historical narrative. But there are very different sorts depending on the intent of the author. So now let me be a little bit clearer about different types of history writing. So, and this will be, I hope, very helpful to you. There are at least 5 or more types of historical writing. The first I want to tell you about is the journal article. Now, the journal article is kind of, this is what we do as professional historians. I've written many journal articles. You can read some if you want. They're really boring for the most part. Journal articles are intended to be very thorough, very precise, deal with all the available evidence to answer a particular question. They're really narrowly focused and super specialized. And by the way, tons of footnotes to texts in the original languages, because that's what you're supposed to do. Okay? So that's a journal article. The journal article's aim is precision and clear logic. Nobody ever wrote a journal article in the ancient world. Okay? That's what modern historians do, but ancient historians never did that. So let's be very careful, because a lot of times we think about, ooh, if it's a historical narrative, it must be really concerned about precise logic and precise accuracy and detail. No, never. Okay? So don't expect an author in the ancient world, any author, Bible or anywhere else, to uphold that kind of standard of accuracy and precision. Nobody ever did it. Nobody ever wanted to. Okay? So let's not presume upon them that they were trying to do that kind of stuff. They are not. But they are doing other kinds of things. There are other kinds of history writing that they were doing. That's one extreme then, super accuracy journal article. The other extreme is something like Santa Claus stories. Now, I apologize to those of you who are not American, because you're going to have a little bit trouble understanding this, but I'll try to explain. We tell Santa Claus stories. We talk to our children. We have Santa Claus in malls at Christmas time, and we talk about Santa Claus doing strange stuff like flying around with flying reindeer in a sleigh around the entire world and going down every chimney and depositing toys on Christmas night. These are all rather silly stories, right? But they are not, the Santa Claus stories are not purely fiction. They have a connection to history. They are not false stories we are telling. They are highly embellished stories with a historical core. There was a historical St. Nicholas. He was a bishop in ancient Turkey about 300 AD. We do have some records about him. He was a man who was renowned for his generosity, his devotion to Christ, a very worthy saint, St. Nicholas. But somehow, over the course of a couple thousand years, the saintly bishop of Myra in ancient Turkey came to be transformed into this silly fellow with a belly full of jelly, hanging around in shopping malls for 3 weeks out of every year, wearing a snowsuit of all things. How did that happen? I actually wrote a journal article on this. So basically what happened was St. Nicholas was honored as a saint. Eventually, when the Turks took over that area, his bones were dug up and moved to Bari in Italy. A shrine was built in his honor, and there's a celebration on December 9th every year in Bari, Italy, in his honor. From there, he became the patron saint of sailors, which I never understood, and pawn shops, which I really don't understand, and children. And his role as patron saint of children moved out throughout Europe, especially in Holland, where he was called Sinterklaas. And Sinterklaas became patron saint of a children's festival there that was on December 9th. Sinterklaas was then imported to New York. I don't know if you know, but New York was, the community there was founded by Dutch. It was called New Holland for a while. And the Dutch brought with them Sinterklaas. In New York, because New Yorkers have trouble pronouncing pretty much everything, they had trouble pronouncing Sinterklaas, so they called him Santa Claus, which is just mispronounced Dutch. Which, if you ever wonder how you get the Spanish Santa, which is female, to the man, don't worry about it. It's not Spanish. So anyhow, so you get Santa Claus in New York, and now Santa Claus in New York gets transformed into this modern creature at the hands of a satirist, a Hebrew professor, and a political cartoonist. The satirist was Washington Irving, who wrote a silly story called The History of the World from Creation to the Dutch Dynasty. And there he had Sinterklaas portrayed in lederhosen on the prow of a ship, and told stories about him at the children's festival, flying around in a horse-drawn cart, and he gave gifts. Later on in New York, a professor of Hebrew at a New York seminary by the name of Clement Moore wrote a little poem for his children. He never published it, but when he died, his maid found it, and his maid had it published. It has probably one of the most famous poems, is now called "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." It was called "A Visit from St. Nicholas." That even would not, by the way, he now takes Santa Claus out of his horse-drawn cart and puts him in a sleigh with flying reindeer, go figure, even names the reindeer, and now he makes him fat, right? And now the original Santa Claus was pretty skinny. This guy's fat, but now paradoxically he goes down chimneys. Anyhow, that Clement Moore's poem then in the 1850s was published with illustrations by a cartoonist, the political cartoonist who made the donkey and the elephant for the political parties in the United States. He made drawings of St. Nicholas. He's the guy who put St. Nicholas in a snowsuit and gave him a new home, by the way, which is the North Pole. Anyhow, it gets weirder from there. Then Macy's department store gets into the act, and they launched a major advertising campaign. By the way, there was no December 9th festival in the United States, so they moved his feast days back a few days to December 25th. So now he delivers toys, right, at Christmas Eve. And Macy's department store launched this advertising campaign, of course, emphasizing the Santa toy connection, an advertising campaign whose success they never could have predicted. So there you have, basically, this is how the Santa Claus story grew over time, but it grew out of historical roots. So the Santa Claus type of history storytelling is the ones that are only loosely connected to history, but they do have a historical core. Okay? That's the other extreme from a journal article. Then there's other variations in between. For example, a history textbook. A history textbook, I mean, in a sense, when I'm lecturing, I'm kind of speaking like a history textbook, right? I'm trying to be careful, I'm trying to be accurate, but I'm having to select. I can only give you a little bit of the information available on a particular topic. I am picking and choosing and shaping things into a narrative that will communicate well to the intended audience. And I'm giving up a whole lot of things that I would have put in a journal article. And I'm connecting the dots where I don't have information, but this connects to that, and it seems to make sense that it might fit this way. And you put all the pieces together. That's a history textbook. We sort of joke, those of us who actually do history, that textbooks are always lying to some degree, right? A textbook is always leaving stuff out and always connecting things that might not connect as cleanly, but you do your best, right? You try to make the most sense out of it and be as accurate as you can, given the constraints you set yourself. Then there are Abraham Lincoln stories. Now, Abraham Lincoln stories are interesting because basically Abraham Lincoln is the whitewashed hero, right? Abraham Lincoln, Americans, about the only things Americans know about Abraham Lincoln is he ended slavery, right? And he gave some really good speeches. He's one of the greatest speech makers in all of American political history. So that's Abraham Lincoln, and that's about what people know about him. What people don't know about him, for example, is his rejection of Christianity. What people don't know about him is he won't darken the door of a church. What people don't know about him is he didn't have to start the Civil War. He started the Civil War, by the way, and hundreds of thousands of people died. But he did it to get rid of slavery, right? Well, but it's not a simple question. He was really quite a political manipulator. There's a lot of things about Abraham Lincoln that are stories we don't usually tell because we want to treat Abraham Lincoln as a hero. So he's the whitewashed hero. Those are the Abraham. Historical person. We're not telling falsehoods when we talk about Abraham Lincoln. We're just telling part of the story. We're telling the part that makes him sound heroic. And then there's my favorite, George Washington. Yes. There's one story that every American child knows from a very young age about George Washington. You usually learn it somewhere in kindergarten or something. It's the George Washington cherry tree story. For those of you who don't know the George Washington cherry tree story, it's very simple. It goes like this. George Washington, first president of the United States. George Washington was, he was at home, and for some reason he had an axe and he had a cherry tree in the backyard and he cut down the cherry tree. His dad came home from work and he said, "Who cut down my cherry tree?" And George Washington famously said, "I cannot tell a lie. I was the one who chopped down the cherry tree." Ta-da! George Washington cherry tree story. What a weird story. But we all tell this story. American teachers and parents in particular tell the George Washington cherry tree story for a very simple reason. You want kids to stop lying. Right? They're lying to you left and right, and you say, oh, be like George Washington. I cannot tell a lie. Right? He's a hero. He teaches us a moral virtue, the moral virtue of honesty. So George Washington, the cherry tree story, is a moral virtue story. Now, did George Washington cherry tree story happen? Did that actually happen? The answer is we don't know. What we do know is the first account of the George Washington cherry tree story was published by a biographer by the name of Mason Weems, who was writing 100 years after George Washington died. Since that's the first time we ever hear of the story, the probability is that the story was at least embellished, if not made up. But that doesn't matter, does it? We're going to keep telling the George Washington cherry tree story. We don't care if it happened or not. And of course, it's very possible there was an authentic oral tradition that Mason Weems used and wrote down a story that actually happened. Or maybe he embellished a story that was sort of like that. We don't know, but it doesn't matter, does it? We are going to keep telling the George Washington cherry tree story in the way we always told it because it's useful for teaching moral virtue. All of these are history writing. All of these are types of history, ways people tell historical stories. All of these appear in the Bible except the journal article. Okay? The question is which one, where, when, how do you tell? Which is never an easy matter. I would also suggest to you that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are none of the above. They're sort of in between somehow, aren't they? Sort of a little bit like Santa Claus, sort of a little bit like Abraham Lincoln, sort of a little, well, actually not so much like Abraham Lincoln, more like George Washington, the cherry tree story, sort of like a textbook. There's a lot of elements in there, and so maybe even in any particular passage, you're moving around among these categories. And you're moving around with a purpose. Remember the human and the divine in Scripture. This is what humans do when they write history. And of course, God, by inspiration, can use any of these methods. The question is which one at any particular time in order for us to be good and responsible interpreters. And that's always a challenge. So let me take you to one more level, which I think is going on in a lot of the biblical texts when the Bible does different types of history. And that is what the Germans call, which I will badly mispronounce, Heilsgeschichte. Okay? Yeah, somebody say it. Give me a good German pronunciation. Yeah, see, that just how I said it, huh? Is that High German or Hochdeutsch? Yeah? Okay. So, that word, literally it means holy history or holy storytelling. Okay? The idea is that what's important in the books of Kings is not, well, there is some moral tales here, right? There's the good king and the bad king, for example. So you do get a little bit of Abraham Lincoln, a little bit of George Washington. You get certain elements of textbook, but you're not going to be anywhere near as complete or thorough as a textbook would be. What you do have is a divine perspective. Each king is judged not, was this a good warrior king? Was this king a good husband? Was this king a great artist? Was this king good at managing territory or handling finances? Those aren't the questions that our author is asking, are they? Instead, the author is asking, is this a godly king? Are the people living according to the covenant? That's the story that our author is interested in. And that's the story we get. So all the selection of material that's included is material that has a bearing on that particular question. It is holy history. It is not history of these other sorts. So I just want you to be careful as you look at the biblical text. Don't just think, is this historical narrative, but what kind of historical narrative are we dealing with? And how is God using that particular type of historical narrative to give us a divine perspective on what's going on. Does that make sense? So I think that can help give you a little bit more nuance. So in sum, what can we say about this whole idea of the DH as one major collection of compositions that all focus in on a similar theme, all have a similar perspective, etc. And by the way, you're going to want to contrast this with Chronicles. So Chronicles is going to cover some of the same issue, and you're going to see when an author has a different agenda, they're going to focus in on different stuff, right? Yeah. So do pay attention to that. My very simple response is I think there's a lot to this theory. I think those books do hold together in a certain way. The one I have the hardest trouble fitting is Joshua. Joshua it's so much different from the other books and has such a different perspective that I have trouble fitting the book of Joshua in with the rest of them. It's a very different kind of writing. So I will express hesitation about whether the book of Joshua is part of this overall composition. But the rest of them, I think, do fit fairly well, and every leader is consistently judged on the same standards that grow out of Deuteronomy. And let me conclude this section by calling your attention back to Joshua. Even though I have my doubts about its inclusion in the Deuteronomistic history, there is something about that central question that Joshua raised that all of these texts we've been reading focus in on. And that is a fundamental choice. Every human being has a fundamental choice. And the Deuteronomistic history, to the extent that it exists, constantly calls us back to that choice. What are you going to choose? Are you going to live according to the law of God? Are you going to live according to God's covenants? Are we going to love God and follow his commandments or not? In some ways, it really does become that simple. And I love the way Joshua puts it. He says, you're going to have to choose. You, all of you, individually, are going to have to choose. And by the way, you can't just choose today. You have to choose tomorrow and the next day. You've got to keep choosing the way of God or not. But decide. And when you decide, there will be consequences. And then that lovely line, which I have quoted up on my refrigerator at home. We have made a choice. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let's pray. Lord, we're all challenged by the choice to follow you on a daily basis. Lord, give us the strength and the wisdom and the perspective to choose you. And as we choose you, we choose life. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, one more. Tell you what, stand up, stretch for 1 minute, and we will go on to the next and final lecture for today.